Hi, everyone. Today, what we're going to do is continue to get into a symbolic interactionism as kind of laid out for us in the textbook. How the authors lay out symbolic interactionism is very typical to the perspectives approach as a whole. What they do is start at the very micro level, like we did with our last class, and then work our way up as we're going to start doing today. So, kind of look at kind of the mind and how the mind is created, how the mind operates, and then get into kind of how the mind relates to identity. And then, towards the end of the semester, we work our way up from the bottom to get more collective action, collective behavior. So, looking at the last chapter, briefly recapping it, we looked at individuals as symbol makers and symbol users. And basically, the making process is how we start to learn different meanings. We make these symbols, we make these meanings part of our minds, part of ourselves. And we do so through socialization. And we'll get into socialization further today. And then what we do as symbol users, we take what we've learned, we take what we've internalized, and use that to kind of navigate our social life, use it to guide our ways through the social world, what means what to do, what not to do, so on and so on. So today's topic is socialization and identity. So let's formally kind of introduce ourselves to socialization. Although we have used this word, although we have defined it previously in the class. So socialization can be taught or thought of as teaching and learning cultural ways. So it's a kind of a two-step process. There's teaching going on and there's learning going on. And when learning and teaching go on, people start to learn cultural ways of a society. And kind of within this process, you learn how to think in certain situations, how not to think, what is appropriate thinking, what is inappropriate thinking. Again, the same ideas with feeling and acting. What's appropriate, what is not, how you should act, how you shouldn't. The same thing with feelings. So again, you're not born with all these things instinctually. Learning how to navigate the social world in terms of thinking, feeling, and acting. These are social creations as we start to learn our culture. And so understanding that, we can see that people are active agents. So, a lot of different theories, focus on socialization and culture, but a lot of them just assume it goes on automatically. We just get exposed to culture repeatedly, and we make that culture part of our social cognitive makeup. In SI, we believe that people are active agents. You can intentionally kind of seek out information if you want to find more about something. You can intentionally, teach people certain ways of the world. So again, it doesn't go on, unconsciously. It doesn't go on without people's awareness. The socialization process is typically intentional. You're learning something because you want to learn something, you want to understand, or perhaps you're teaching something because you want others to learn it, you want other people to understand. And so in addition, symbolic interactionists, kind of going back to their main premises, we talk about how when the socialization process occurs, just because we are learning something doesn't mean we have to accept it or endorse it. So that can occur, but also you can kind of modify the lesson being learned, or you can simply reject it. So, I think about as I was growing up, and my mom, I don't think my dad ever said anything about it, but my mom would sometimes talk to me about using foul language, bad language. And so on the one hand, if a parent says to you, don't use foul language, don't use bad language, you could accept that wholeheartedly and never use a bad word. Or you can modify it, recognizing that, yeah, you're right. I shouldn't be using these words, all the time. But if the situation emerges, if the occasion arises, perhaps I can throw out, one word or the other. So I won't, use bad language all the time, but I'll save it for certain situations where it's a good fit for the situation. Or on the other hand, you can reject it totally and say, I'm just going to use, bad words. I'm gonna use foul language all the time. I don't care what people think. So that's what we can look at. Just kind of one example. You're kind of being socialized to learn something, but you can, modify it. You can reject it, or you can accept it altogether. So finally, we can say that socialization is a dual influence. So we think about kind of the one-way street where the teacher is influencing the learner, but it's a actual two-way street. The learner often influences the teacher at the same time. And you see this often in parent-child interactions. So a lot of gender studies have showed that, you know, fathers get a lot more kind of feminine in their behaviors when they have daughters. They kind of reach to this side of them that typically they haven't, gone into. And that's compared to when they have sons, where, they have sons, they kind of practice the traditional masculinity more. And so, having a child, a daughter or a son can have, one type of influence on a parent or another. We see it, in the student-teacher relationships. How I go about things is not only a creation of my own approach, but the reaction to how students are receiving my approach. So again, you kind of adjust things along the way based upon that feedback you receive. And so it's that two-way street socialization, a dual influence, what we can call it. So here we can start to recognize how situations and the socialization going on in those situations start to produce that identity. So again, kind of starting at that bottom level, starting to recognize, what's going on up here, learning the symbols, using the symbols, the socialization in general, you start to build an identity. So again, you're not born with an identity in terms of how you're supposed to understand yourself. You learn those self-understandings throughout the socialization process. And so this socialization process, you can get influences from a past situation that can influence, the socialization process itself. So, in the past, perhaps, your parents have always used foul language in the house, and now a teacher is telling you that you can't use it. So maybe your past situation where it's typically okay to use it at home, but now I'm told I can't use it at school. You kind of reject that information from the teacher. Or on the other hand, you can start to say, current situations can influence somebody's socialization process. So here, current situations can be in terms of feelings. So one's emotional state can often influence how they interpret the social world, where those who typically are at a kind of higher level of emotional state, higher levels of mental health, are typically more optimistic about what they kind of learn about the social world compared to those who are struggling with mental health, those who have depression. They're typically more pessimistic. It's interesting to find that those who are more realistic typically are those people who are depressed compared to those people who are really optimistic about things. Nevertheless, there's a connection between kind of one's current kind of emotional state and their socialization experience. So we can kind of move forward a little bit to recognize not only does a person's past or a person's kind of current state influence the socialization process, are they accepting it? Are they rejecting it? Are they modifying it? But also kind of the socialization source to begin with. So we can say we have primary socialization sources and secondary sources as well. So here we start to go back to Charles Cooley and his ideas of primary groups and secondary groups and how these groups influence individual identity from emerging. So basically, primary sources, primary groups of socialization are basically groups to which you have a strong bond. And so usually we think of family, but not everybody has a very strong bond with their family. Family is often, a primary source, but doesn't have to be. It's basically any group, any source to which you have that strong bond, which we can distinguish secondary sources, secondary groups, thus as being groups you don't have a strong bond with, groups you lack a bond emotionally, cognitively. So The idea simply is groups to which you belong and you have a strong connection to, those groups are more influential on you in terms of how you see the world, in terms of how you see yourselves, compared to more weaker bonds. Those groups you may belong to, but you don't care as much maybe as your fellow classmates in college compared to your roommates in your apartment or something like that. So we can say that the socialization process is not only about learning about place, the ways of the world, like we talked about last class, about people, social identities, and how we see people in terms of their gender, their class, their race. But now we can say the socialization process uh, helps us learn about ourselves. We don't automatically know who we are. We have to learn that through social experience. So now we can get further into Cooley and also bring Mead into the conversation when it comes to the emergence of identity. So, when looking at the development of sociological ideas, you have to recognize, where people are and kind of what's going on around them, but also what's happened before them. So, kind of before Cooley and Mead, a lot of people focused on biological, physiological explanations of identity, or what's often referred to personality. Here we're starting to, get away from that, get away from recognizing identity and personality as something that is inborn. So again, the change basically was over time, one's personality or identity wasn't some kind of religious event. God creates you in a certain way, and that is who you are as you live your life. In modernity, modern society, we started to focus on science. Basically, you're born with certain genetics, you're born with certain physiologies. That makes you who you are. You're simply born that way. But in sociology, we started to get away from that. So at the same time period, kind of rejecting some ideas, we're saying, no, the identity does not emerge from the inside out. It's heavily created from the outside in. So those are those ideas we start to see here with Cooley and Mead. So a key concept that we talked about briefly before from Cooley is the looking glass self. The looking glass self simply captures the process of one's identity being created, one's identity changing through the feedback they've received socially. And so some examples I have, if you come to see yourself as smart, as intelligent, that's something that's socially created. You need the feedback that allows you to see that. So perhaps, your parent, and when you're growing up, always tells you how smart you are, how bright you are. But then you get to school and you start to get C's and D's and you have trouble, getting through your courses. Then that new form of feedback, the C's and the D's and the teachers telling you to try harder, that changes your self-view, and you can, you no longer see yourself as being intelligent or smart. No, it can change again. Let's say, you struggle through high school, but you get to college and everything seems to click. So the new feedback, the A's on your papers, the professor is telling you that you do good work. So this new social feedback you can take and start to see yourself in a new way as somebody who's intelligent, somebody who's smart. And the same thing can be applied to if you think you're funny, if you think you're humorous, or if you think you're attractive. So again, people have to laugh at your jokes. People have to tell you you're funny for you to actually start to believe you are funny. And that can change over time. And it changes rather quickly when you're a teacher. One class, you're killing it. Everybody's having a good time. The next class, nobody smiles, nobody laughs a bit. So it can be quite the dilemma. Well, I thought I was funny, but I guess I'm not that funny. And the same thing with being attractive. Often we link attractiveness simply to one's physicality, physical appearance. But if somebody comes to see themselves as attractive, it's as much as a social creation at the same time. Socially, people have to tell you that you're attractive, you're good looking, you're pretty. People have to tell you that in different ways, such as you're getting asked out a lot. You don't struggle to find partners, you don't struggle to find dates. And so, all that feedback kind of tells you there's something about you that's attractive. But then again, let's say that, you always went to the dances in high school, you always found a partner when you're looking for one in high school, but you get to college and nobody gives you the time of the day. You start to kind of rethink yourself in terms of, am I really attractive or not? And so again, one's identity is socially created, but very fluid in nature because based upon new forms of feedback, you can start to get new ideas of self. And sometimes when you get one type of feedback, socially speaking, from people, you can act against it intentionally. So you don't have to simply accept, the feedback that's given to you. On the one hand, if nobody tells you you're smart and you can't pass a class, then you'd be crazy to think yourself to see yourself as intelligent. When everything tells you this and you think that, that's how we conceptualize crazy often, informally speaking. But sometimes we can take feedback and kind of use that to try to put on a different front. And I remember a kid in high school. He was very bright, but kind of clumsy. Basically, he kind of got labeled as kind of a nerdy guy, not kind of full out nerd, but kind of geeky, a little bit nerdy, a little bit awkward. And so he kind of rejected that. He wanted to go against those labels, and so all of a sudden he started to try to be tough. He's tried to pick fights with people. Often those fights did not end well for him. But nevertheless, I think back on him as an example. He didn't like the feedback and the labels he was receiving, so he tried to kind of push back against them by trying to come across as somebody who's tough, somebody who's strong. So, you can see in some situations where you want to reject some feedback and to really, get that feedback off you, you have to put on a new front and make that new front successful for people to see you in a new way. So now going to me, we can see three different stages where the identity, where one sense of self emerges. The first stage, you really don't distinguish kind of who you are from other people in terms of kind of separate beings. You can kind of see maybe relationships that are there, but you can't define kind of the other person from yourself. And so basically you just have a bunch of kind of people around you, but you don't have, labels for them, and you don't have a label for yourself in relation to them yet. In the second stage, the play stage, here you start to develop the ability to kind of play out the role of the other person. So here you start to kind of recognize this person as a parent, and I understand the parenting task, the parenting responsibilities. Oh, I recognize this person as a teacher, or this person as a doctor. So I can play teacher, I can play doctor. So you're kind of taking on the role of the other and kind of starting to see and act in the world in their shoes, which is a step forward from stage one, because you start to distinguish yourself from the other person. You're defining the other person as somebody who entails certain tasks and responsibilities as a person. And then that third stage, the game stage, you develop a sense of your own position within relationships. So I'm the student in relation to the teacher. I'm the daughter or the son in relation to the parent. I am the patient in relation to the doctor. So here you start to develop, your own kind of position within these different relationships. And when you start to understand these positions, you start to understand different senses of self. And so the self is very, we can say fluid. It changes from situation to situation. You're a patient, when you're at the doctor's office. You're a student when you're at school. You're the son or daughter when you're at home. So your sense of self varies from the place to place in the situation. But also you kind of recognize your responsibilities in those situations. So you start to get this sense of self, not only in terms of label, a student, a patient, a son or daughter, but what that means to be a son or daughter. What's expected of you in that role compared to what's expected of you in the other roles. And so in this game stage, you also develop a sense of community. You recognize kind of your position in relation to other people around you. And that again allows you to emerge as a individual in a social situation, and you recognize kind of how people are connected to one another, the different relations, but also how people are distinguishable by their different roles and their different responsibilities within those relationships. So now we can end today's class, because I broke up this chapter into two different parts. We can end today's class by looking at the emergence of gender and gender identity. So, just like everything else, the knowledge of what to do or not to do in terms of being a male or female, that is something that is not inborn, it's not innate. So it's something we have to recognize as being created from the outside in. So, kids are just kids until they start to learn to see themselves as boys or as girls. And that's the socialization process of kind of teaching gender to individuals. So what we say, we gendered people. We gender people by teaching them, what to do, what not to do as girls and as boys, and by teaching them kind of the ways of the world according to meanings we associate with masculinity and femininity. So this gender socialization process is learned directly and indirectly. So basically, typically what we see, when looking at, females and males, we try to socialize females in terms of femininity, and we try to distance females from masculinity, and we try to socialize males in terms of masculinity, and we try to distance those males from femininity. And once you start to kind of learn those lessons, typically you start to teach yourself in the same way. You start to practice femininity or masculinity. And at the same time, you try to distance yourself from the other gender ideas. So we say often doing gender, the behavior that expresses masculinity and femininity, whether it be through how you're dressed, how you style your hair, how you decorate your body, your overall kind of interest and hobbies, how you display gender is something that not only embraces kind of one gender, but it kind of rejects the other at the same time. So, through that socialization process, you have a parent, you have friends, you have siblings, classmates teaching you directly what it means to be a boy or girl. And then you also have what we call vicarious learning by observation, whether it be watching television, movies, or simply just kind of observing the everyday world in terms of how certain people act as men and women, and how they display forms of masculinity or femininity. So, once you learn this on your own, you begin to perform gender, and these expectations you perform basically make gender something that's an achievement. So on the one hand, in sociology, we say gender is not something you have, it's something you do. You perform it. So, if I came into class and I was kind of very shy, I was cowering all the time, I was somewhat emotional, and you could say that biologically speaking, Dr. Orr is a guy, but he kind of doesn't act like one. And so that's kind of that distinction we make in sociology. We have one sex, the kind of biological person, but also we have one's gender, their behaviors they give. And so you can have one sex, you can be a guy, but not necessarily act like one. And the same thing holds true for women. She's a girl, but she doesn't really act like one. So that kind of captures how we perform gender, how it's an act, and how sex can be related to it. The sex can also be seen as something else. So here you start to see that gender performances are kind of operating within a system of rewards and punishments. And here, gender not only is something that you do, it's an act, but gender becomes an achievement. So to be seen as a real guy, biologically, I have to have certain properties, but socially, I have to come across and act in certain ways to be considered kind of a real guy. And the same thing for if you're, a woman. Not only can people physically see you, as a female, So you have to give the proper performance to achieve the status of a real woman. And so here we start to get into the reward system. And so the chapter here, primarily, the first half at least, primarily concentrates on younger individuals. But you can, generalize these things to older individuals as well. And we'll get into that conversation a little bit more in our next class. So this reward system, in terms of being rewarded or being punished, it's both going on socially and personally. And so we can call this a form of policing. So socially, people can give you kind of rewards when you're kind of giving them what they expect to see out of you, as a boy or as a girl. So, when boys perform masculinity and they kind of perform it to high levels, you reward them. So, boy athletes, young men who are really good athletes typically are elevated to a higher status. And because you connect sports and athletics to masculinity strongly. And again, there's difference with women. Yeah. You don't reward women as much when they're good athletes because you don't associate femininity with athletics as much. You reward them, you say good job, but they're not elevated to the same high status compared to male athletes and their connection to sports. So you can start to see how if you can perform your gender very well, so maybe if you're the prettiest, girl in school, if you're the toughest guy in school, people will elevate you because you're kind of giving them the expected gender performances and you're doing it very well. Even if you're not the best looking, even if you're not the best athlete, but you're simply kind of following the rules of the game when it comes to gender performances, you are rewarded in a sense that people treat you normally. And so sometimes, we think of rewards only being kind of the praise and being elevated at a higher level than everybody else. But being treated as kind of one of the gang and being treated as normal is very rewarding in itself. All you have to do to recognize that is to recognize how you feel when you're treated abnormally, when people punish you. So here's where the other side of the coin in the system, the reward and the punishment. The punishment comes when you're not giving people kind of what they want. So again, especially at kind of this younger age level where typically people are more tied to the expectations that people have for younger girls and younger boys. And so, when you're not acting like a boy, when you're not acting like a girl, you can be sanctioned, you can be punished. People treat you negatively by how they speak to you. They may make fun of you. They could socially kind of marginalize you. So again, being treated as normal is very rewarding compared to being treated as different and being treated in negative ways. So there's kind of the social policing dimension, but also we can see self-policing. Often if we can perform the gender properly, you can feel really good about yourself. So, if you are that star athlete and you're a guy, you feel like you have more self-worth compared to, other guys who are not good at sports. And so you can reward yourself when you're performing gender as you're expected to perform it. But also, kind of the other side of the coin is if you feel like you don't fit, if you feel like a fish out of water when it comes to people expecting you to act a certain way as a girl or as a boy, that's when you can start to feel bad about yourself. You can start to get kind of lower levels of self-esteem and self-worth. You're doing self-punishment rather than relying on other people to punish you. So finally, we could talk about this concept of border work, which they talk about in the chapter. So basically here is where we see kind of people imposing the rules of the games on others. And so kind of treating, students, treating people and not as students and not as people, but as girls and boys. So we talk about this a lot in my intro class when it comes to sports. We don't see, kids as athletes. We see them as, female and male athletes. And accordingly, we'll push them into different sports. We have certain sports for her, certain sports for him. So we're kind of doing this border work by kind of treating them differently and creating kind of a social separation of the individuals based upon their sex and the sports they are supposed to be playing. And so we start to see that in other areas too. Again, rather than treating your children like children, you start to treat your kids like boys and girls rather than treating your students as girls and boys students. Excuse me, rather than treating your students as students, you treat them as boy and girl students. And I remember my mom was a kindergarten teacher. And so sometimes there's this one semester where there's construction going on at my school. So they shipped all of us to my mom's school. And so every day after school, I would go to my mom's class and she'd be wrapping up things with her kindergartners. And every time she had the room organized where the boys were in one area of the class and the girls were in the other. So again, here's this example of what we call border work. My mom's kind of creating different borders by treating the kids not as kids but treating them as girls and boys, and kind of within these spaces you kind of expect people to practice femininity if they're girls, and in these spaces you expect people to perform masculinity if they're boys. So again, this is all kind of focused on a younger level, and things will kind of change overall as we develop through the life course. And we'll start to get into that discussion a little bit more in our next class. So I'll leave that here for now. This kind of part of the chapter ties into the paper 1 requirements. So make sure to familiarize yourself with the requirements, because they nicely kind of parallel what we talked about here today. So I'll leave that there for today, and I will continue this chapter next time.